So we're going to start the panel on cognitive aging and cognitive interventions. And first I just want to thank Joe and Liz for putting this together. It's just the first panel is a really hard act to follow. It was wonderful. Okay, so we have an amazing group of speakers. Just a little bit of a heads up, Jen Manley's plane was delayed and she's going to be walking in any minute, so we're going to rearrange the order just a bit. So we do have a wonderful group of speakers, and I want to tell you that this is just not your grandparents' cognitive aging group. That traditionally, cognitive aging research tends to be lab-based. We tend to study smallish samples of older adults who are willing to come into a college campus. We tend to study relatively well-educated samples of older adults because they will match the very handy young adult controls who are the college students so we can get in the lab for credit. And there tends to be either an explicit or implicit understanding that when you come to the lab, your wits are being tested, and the object of your wits being tested is that you are an object of study. There also tends to be an implicit or explicit understanding that age is a relevant dimension of the research. And then cognitive interventions. Hey, Jen, come on up. I want to give a hand to Jen Manley. She's just been through hell and back. What a trooper. We're going on as planned. And then when we look at cognitive interventions, they tend to look a lot like the tasks that people do in the lab. So to make all this work, we kind of assume that the younger and older samples are comparable. We assume that such younger and older samples are representative of some larger population. And we also assume that the lab is a neutral context that's going to be representative of everyday behavior, and that the specific lab tasks that we do are representative of everyday performance. And our first best guess for interventions is that we're going to directly practice, give instruction and practice in the very things that we study in the lab, that show deficits in the lab. So today we're going to question all of these assumptions and turn all of this on its head. So just to start, so are well-educated, older community-dwelling adults who are often retired and younger college students comparable? Well, probably on many dimensions, and we've learned a lot from those studies. But now there's also an enormous literature with animal models and human subject research that's demonstrated a large extent of neuroplasticity. I mean, we've shown that you rewire the brain by learning to juggle, for God's sake. Navigational expertise rewires the brain. Students who are studying for medical exams have different wiring. Musical training changes the brain, and even learning a second language changes the brain. So we know that we are, it's not that the brain is a static entity that's just showing brain rot, that we are constantly being molded by experience. So it's entirely plausible that at least some of the differences that we see between younger college students and older adults from the community are because of some patterns of engagement over the previous few years, last year, 6 weeks, whatever, we don't know. Okay, how representative are college students and education-matched community-dwelling older adults? Well, probably not very. Among other things, 14% of the adults in this country don't read very well. They read at a level that's below basic. So maybe recognize words, but not being able to understand sentences or be able to use text to think and to reason and to navigate through everyday life. Globally, if you look at the data from the PIAC, the U.S. is pretty much in the middle. We're not particularly bad or particularly good or particularly bad. We're kind of right in the middle. So this is a global issue. So the fact that we tend to be studying college-educated adults may have certain limitations. There is some work that suggests that maybe this kind of experience, as not surprisingly, has implications for intellectual functioning and even mortality, and not just because of health. There's lots of mechanisms there. By the way, that's the headline that came out in USA Today when this was published. It's 1 in 7 adults can't read this article. So addressing this today is going to be Jen Manley, who made it. She's going to be talking about the implications of sociocultural context for cognitive aging. So we know, so she's at the forefront of work looking at how education differences and racial effects can create health disparities and disparities in cognition. And Laura Germain is going to, Laura Germain is going to be talking about how we can use technology to expand this reach. Another way that this is not your grandparents' cognitive aging is we're going to consider whether the lab is a neutral context. So is the lab a neutral context, as we learned this morning? Maybe not. So in a lot of experiments, there have been a number of experiments that have shown this through direct manipulations, in addition to just the work on stereotypes more broadly. If you judge, Tammy Brahal showed some time ago that if you just ask younger and older adults to learn as opposed to remember information, you can wipe out age differences. So we have memory stereotypes about older adults don't remember, but we don't have such ingrained stereotypes about learning, so you can minimize the age differences that way. Tom Hess's work priming younger and older adults with reading a newspaper article that was either had positive information about aging that emphasized the way you can take control of aging versus a negative view where you have to rely on others. That can change. That can change memory performance. And even something simple like Cindy Adams' work, showing that you tell a story, if you ask older adults to tell a story to a child, as opposed to retell to an experimenter, that can wipe out age differences. Dave Gallo is going to talk today about the effects of social context on performance among older adults and its normal underpinnings. Is the best pathway to intervention to target lab-based cognitive tasks? Well, what we've seen so far from this work is that when we do cognitive training that targets specific cognitive abilities, we get improvement in those very specific cognitive abilities, but it doesn't seem to generalize very far. We've learned a lot from that work. And it's optimistic in showing plasticity, but it's very disappointing in showing lack of transfer. And on the other hand, if you look at people who are thriving, older adults who are doing really well, and cognitively resilient, they seem to be broadly engaged in a whole lot of other things. They seem to be interacting with people, engaged in intellectual pursuits, they read. And so, causation there is, of course, really murky, but that's what Denise Park is going to talk about. So Denise Park is going to talk about non-traditional approaches to interventions.